Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this artist talk. I thought it'd be nice to start with talking about how this project came about. There's so many sort of beautiful interweavings and connections here. So I thought that'd be a nice way to start, Gianna.
Yeah, how the project came about, like me and Abe doing the
You and Abe and then me and then everyone else has been involved.
Yeah, it's been really sweet. Well, Abe was visiting some months ago and we were just kind of marveling at the space and how beautiful it is and what potential it has for an exhibition. And we put it out there as an idea and had kind of loosely talked about your practice, and then I had some of the newspaper studies out and thought, well, actually this could work really well together, not only like visually in terms of the monochrome palette, but also in interesting conceptual ways. And so we decided to commit to it, and Abe bought a ticket to London. And then it was something we were going to do essentially for ourselves, to kind of give some space to these practices that have been ongoing for so many years, and in many ways quietly. And then we were at Morning Paley, and Abby introduced us, and then we met up and decided to have a show all together, and you were on board to curate it, so we're very, very fortunate for that.
Yeah, the nice thing for me is that there's, I did a show in this exact space about like 15 months ago, which Gianna came to, and she was sort of viewing this as a flat, as a sort of place for her to live and use as a studio. And so there's that sort of beautiful continuation for me in the show with me being here, like, you know, that sort of year and a bit ago, and Monty living here, who's now the sculpture behind you,
exactly.
and he's very much present in the show, both in the sort of plaster cast and like his sort of remaining leg hairs.
Yes, his leg hairs are embedded in the plastic.
But then, yeah, I only met Abe just last Monday. We had some sort of lovely video calls talking about the show, yeah, we had a little group chat, and that's where the name of the show actually came about, Memory Put a Walkway, which, yeah.
Because I thought there was a walkway outside along the canal side, and there wasn't. And a lot of the work in the show, and I offhandedly said this, and I think one of you said that was a good line or something, and we were sort of contemplating more clinical names for the show, and I was just like, well, what about that? Because a lot of what we've done, and you kind of recognized, well, you all together recognized the conceptual relationships that were not totally obvious to me, but have to do with transformations of form over time and through memory, I think, and things taking on new life and passing through different formats. So the sports section is, you know, these overpainted newspaper pieces that Gianna's made that I love so much, partly because I've done so much conceptual work that the artworks do not necessarily offer the means of comprehending the concept, and I think there's such strength in work that like provides, that is, so to speak, conceptual or about its procedure or backstory, but provides the means of comprehension in the moment. So it's at a level of remove, it's taking on a new life, and then both of these pieces of mine are doing that too. So you all kind of, I was just like having fun talking with you all, but you all recognize the kind of conceptual kinship, and it's been great. It's been really meaningful to me, so yeah.
And there were also some practical elements to that name.
Oh yeah, well, how to get the painting over the wall was the reason we were talking about it. So I was like, oh yeah, we can just use the path that's along the side of the building. You know, like, there's no path. I was like, oh, Memory put a walkway there. But fortunately, there is one on that side, so we just climbed over the side of the building and pulled this large painting over it. Yeah.
Not this thing.
Oh, that side of the building.
And something you're touching on there that sort of really connects the work for me is this departure from origin for both of your works. So the sort of, you know, the subjects that you're working with, they're both, you know, unwilling in your case and unknowing, actually working. And I wanted to hear a little bit about how that sort of impacts your relationship with the work, because, you know, so often, especially for your work, it's sort of very confessional, very personal, so having that new sort of level of distance compared to, you know, the rest of your body of work, how has that impacted the practice?
Yeah, I mean, the other pieces that I'm working on that are not the sports section are deeply personal pieces about women, about mothers, about generational knowledge, about what we pass on and what we decide not to pass on. And it's kind of this emotional mining. And before we decided to include these pieces or even to do this show, I was working on that series and feeling like it's revealing because it's also a lot of self-portraits, and I don't do self-portraits, and so it's been kind of confrontational with myself in interesting ways. And then I was also like, you know what, I'm gonna do, no matter what, I'm gonna do 5 drawings a day. And I just started doing these 5 drawings a day every day after I would paint. And the thing that I was really enjoying was actually drawing on the sports section. And it was light, and it was about masculinity, but it was also this kind of playful approach to masculinity, talking about very heavy subject matter, but completely the opposite of like the history of women, you know, and the history of women in my life and how I've kind of become part of that and rejected certain parts of that or healed certain parts of that. And so the two series seem to balance each other really well, and the sports section was a way to work on a material that's not precious. These are newspapers that you can get at Sainsbury's or Tesco or anywhere, and the material is abundant, so I can get as many newspapers as I want and make as many as I want, and I have stacks and stacks of newspapers. And so there was really no pressure in the production of this work, and it was very playful and very much like I would see a composition and think, oh, this is going to work, this is going to be great, and so it offered a kind of balance to the weight of the other series I was working on. And not to say that the subject of masculinity is less weighty than that of femininity, or the history of women, but in this context of sports, somehow it's reframed, like sports is this kind of container that allows certain permissions that are the expressions are warlike or religious, you know, there's kind of a religious connotation to a lot of the forms, but they're sports, and they're not something, it's not someone losing their child or it's not something so grave. It's really about winning or losing a game with a ball, and so there is a way to talk about much more serious subject matter within the context of this like boundary of the playing field, and so they've been very fun to produce and very lighthearted in a way to produce, and have had a lot of joy. Even the sculpture was like such a pleasure and such a joy to make, and it was so collaborative. And so this series just feels like a very playful and very joyful series that is, I mean, what the pieces that are on view here are a few of probably hundreds of newspaper drawings that I've been doing for the past 10 years.
And that collaborative element, I think, is especially interesting in both of your work. But the ways I see it in your work is that there's these athletes who, you know, they're just sort of going about their day, they're playing their sport, they're getting captured by the photographer who's making his own decisions, then the newspaper editor who's making his own decisions, and then you're approaching it at that sort of end point. And then, you know, for you, Abe, you're working with, how many people would you say worked with you on this work?
Well, I have never thought about that, but if it starts with one person whose work I've in some sense appropriated, or whose memory I've carried on, you know, for those who don't know, it's in brief about carrying on the practice of someone who's no longer making art, like taking it over without telling him or asking, just trying to make his art for him, which is of course not possible. But by doing something impossible to perhaps create a monument to a lost future that he didn't permit himself. So there's this one person who's kind of embalmed in glass in the distance. And then there's a group of philosophers and art historians, probably 6 or 7 of them. David Joslett, the art historian, Peter Zendy, the philosopher, Harvey Letterman, the philosopher, Alex Jovanovich, the artist and critic who I worked with at Art Forum in the past, John Miller, the artist, and a few other people were consultants on looking at the reconstruction of the destroyed painting that a painting that was destroyed by the artist's ex after around the time he stopped making art. Some of his artwork was destroyed by a former partner. And I had one of them reconstructed from memory, and then I had this group of consultants study the reconstruction in order to make speculations, as you all of course know, about what the artist might have made in a completely speculative fashion. And they were all highly reluctant because they are, by their very careers, and they're all like very prominent people in thinking about art, and none of them ever tell artists what to make. It's precisely the opposite of their purpose. And so I felt almost in a way that it was proof that I was doing something kind of novel, that they were all like, I can't do that. And I was like, well, that's the premise of the project. In fact, one of them said the line, I couldn't possibly fantasize. So I thought was really good. And as far as like the point you make about enjoyment, but first to say that I've mainly worked with one kind of primary assistant and then like 3 others who have various roles in the fabrication of the work. So maybe like 10 people are all around. The consultants, because I have various social relationships with them, it became awkward to pay them. I tried to pay them, but they ended up instead sending them archery equipment as presents. And then the assistants are very, very well compensated, basically, fairly compensated. But yeah, the thing about enjoyment I thought was really nice because you were talking about dailiness and sketch and drawing, basically. And I have like a writing practice that takes up my mornings, which I basically feel is like being crucified. Like I hate doing it. It's just like pure pain. And then my art projects, which perhaps for that reason I don't know which one I'm better at. One's pain and one's like joy, basically. It's very strange. I am more of a writer and less of a fine artist, but the visual projects I found been where the literary work leads for whatever reason. But all of this stuff started as some sort of joyful impulse that I acted on, rather than the kind of grinding misery of the writing process. Yeah,
that's interesting.
But as a theme, the enjoyment is part of it, I think, too. Like, I did this because it was fun, you know? Well, maybe a bit less this series, more so the works on paper I have here, which came out of a very similar process.
Very similar.
I was writing, I wrote this essay, the sort of takedown essay in the New Yorker poetry section like 10 years ago, which was about how this editor had asked me to explain why I had this personal habit of adding random quotation marks around words and phrases in the copies of the magazine that I have. And I was like, oh, it's the poetry, so frustrating, I have to like mess with it. And so she commissioned an essay to write. I wasn't expecting. I didn't do it in any outwardly oriented way, which is how you started.
Newspapers,
Yeah. So.
And then it started with a newspaper is also interesting.
Yeah, totally. Periodicals.
Yeah.
I guess this is more about grief. So I think that there's a difference there, except that you are kind of talking about arenas of sanctioned expression of feeling, you know. And this is about masculine, a friendship with a man that I felt a lot of grief about, like the loss of his friendship that was very tied into his departure from art. And I felt so sort of, not just personally betrayed or upset by it, but sort of on behalf of all of the like people who cared about his art, So this, for me, perhaps in a more abstract relationship to like the expression of suffering on a soccer field, is like an arena in which I can like find form for the feeling of that loss, I guess.
Yeah, and something interesting that you shared with me about the work is that so the Disney characters that you see here, I was very interested in sort of why they were there or sort of where they emerged from, and I understand it's from the original painting as well, but it's also a connection to an essay by Eisenstein on Disney.
Yeah.
So in this essay, he's very interested in sort of the success of Disney and why that might be happening, and something he's particularly interested in is the idea of the pre-rational and the pre-logical mind. So the idea that when you're engaging with cartoons, you know, it's recalling that sort of childhood sense of freedom you had before you had a logical mind and before you had a rational mind and before you went through these sort of moments of development and sort of learning how to behave correctly. And I also see that as an interesting moment for your work within sports, that for these men, whilst, you know, in their general life, they may be expected to perform the sort of stoicism associated with masculinity. Suddenly, once they step on that pitch, you know, all the rules are out, and they're able to really tap into their, you know, some more natural, emotional, expressive instincts. They're able to throw it, like, you know, they're able to, you know, grab each other, scream, or you know, lay on the floor and cry, like Monty does there. And I think that's interesting, that sort of spatial specificity of, you know, the freedom within the sports section.
Yeah, the freedom, also the kind of childlike freedom in many ways that is associated with cartoons of like really radical emotion, that you can cry but also jump into another person's arms and wrap your legs around them and kiss them, and as soon as you remove that context, the kind of emotional core is distilled, and you see these just men hugging and crying and kissing and expressing, and there's something so potent and beautiful about that, but also so boundaried. Like, why in this context is that allowed, and why don't we see that even at a funeral? You know, people aren't expressing grief through their body language in the same way that they would on a playing field in other equivalent kind of devastating circumstances. Not even that it's equivalent, it's less equivalent to go, you know, it's less relevant to go to a funeral. But like, maybe it is that it's a game, and so you can express more freely. Or maybe it's that it has the kind of victory and defeat, these words, victory and defeat, that give it kind of warlike association, and so suddenly it can be taken very seriously. Whereas I don't know if that is the same outside of the playing field, and I also don't know if that's the same for women. If we can express so freely rage or being pissed off, you know, like it's something where we have these like orders in place for how we interact with each other and with the world that are almost preset. And as soon as you take away the context, suddenly it just changes the interpretation radically. Even how we hold our bodies, our posture now, how we're sitting, like all of this is a kind of preset architecture that informs how we engage with each other, how we think about ourselves, how we're allowed to express or not allowed to express. And that even beyond the project of the sports section, I'm just generally interested in those settings and what happens when we play with those settings a little bit, and how things shift radically if, you know, we were all sitting on the floor and you were all sitting in chairs, or if, you know, these small things change that suddenly completely upend the social norms and can be quite rebellious. And I think the sports section is a very simple way of kind of adjusting the context and adjusting the dial a little bit, so that what stands out is not the game, but the actual people and their relationship and the freedom that they have within this space. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for your work within, I'm thinking specifically within your video work here, this idea of, so for Abe's video work, A Conversation About Trees, there's, Abe is doing some therapy, as we explained earlier, on behalf of art, and what I think is very interesting is the sort of the humorous elements that perhaps come out when the context is sort of shifted, when the person who's supposed to be doing the therapy is no longer involved.
Totally.
Was it funny for you whilst it was happening, or was that something that sort of happened later?
I'm definitely driven by the humor and the premise of occupying an ontologically impossible position, for sure. I mean, a lot of it is very sad and dark subject matter in a way, but then the humor of like doing something fundamentally invalid or existentially invalid in some sense. And yet, this guy, the artist in question, many years ago, and I made this sort of related series that we were discussing the other evening of these sort of text-based abstractions based on language that had to do with this phrase that he once said, "My trout hurts." I don't know why he said this. It was in an offhand conversation. He said the phrase, "My trout hurts," which we don't have a trout. It's not a body part. Not everyone has a trout. So for your trout to hurt is like for something outside yourself to share the site of subjectivity with you, which is not ontologically possible, and yet we do it, and we do occupy the positions of others in our dreams and in the way we imagine others. And so I was speaking with one of the consultants during the course of the conversations about the film, or about the series rather, and we were in the course of it, we were arguing about Buddhism, and he, being an analytic philosopher, he felt free to sort of take aim at the fundamental thesis of Buddhism, which I thought was really funny. He was like, "There's obviously a self, like there just is a self, it's obvious, like you can't miss my grandmother for me," which means that we have continuity and identity within our personhood. And I told my therapist that, and therapists being people who sort of readily imagine or talk about the ways people imagine occupying more than one imagined self. When I said this thing that this philosopher had said, he said, "Oh, that's so naive." And I thought that was really funny, like, "You can't miss my grandmother for me? Oh, that's so naive." There's also, in time that I spent in Zen Center in New York, one of the prayers that I remember reciting has to do with these vows that the monastics take as part of their practice, which are all of these contradictory commitments to things that they acknowledge they can't do, like sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible, I vow to put an end to them. The Dharma is boundless, the Dharmas are boundless, I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. So commitments to impossible lost causes, I think there is some sort of fundamental drive or sort of tragedy that we're entered into. And now that I'm saying all this, it doesn't sound very humorous, because your question was about humor, but there's something funny about it too. Like, how could I possibly do this? It's like the one thing you can't do for someone else is make their art for them. So it's both funny and kind of tragic for me.
And something I thought was interesting that came up when we were talking about this the other night was someone asked, and I'll ask the same question for everyone, is that you're continuing art practice here. Is there an end point to that? Is there other artists' practice you want to continue, and how does that impact your own?
Yeah.
Is there a separation even? Because at first I thought art was sort of this guise you were perhaps hiding behind.
Yeah. Well, and in that way, none of this work actually looks like his work at all anymore. So it's just me, really, in the end. But for some reason, I needed this like incredibly elaborate apparatus to be myself. So it's possible. I have imagined futures where I am more strictly focused on only making someone else's work and never making my own work. And I did used to attribute my work to another name. I think that this project has some more life to it because part of what I often think about whether my series are open or closed, like whether the project's over. And a lot of the things I do as being kind of serialized conceptual projects could potentially be open.
in some. And this one having to do with like wanting to bring something back to life, because the title is partly related to something I said in childhood after my father had died. Like, do people ever spring out of heaven? So if my memorial is this sort of ironic, not ironic in its conventional sense, but in this sort of idea of a commitment to something impossible, about resurrecting someone who has died in a certain sense, in his creative sense, in my picture of him, which may not correspond to reality, it seems, and I'll never know really, or for now, it would seem appropriate for it to continue rather than just be a bit longer. But we don't just want to give the dead a few years, we want them to live. So I probably will keep it going for a while, and then there's the question that a lot of people are curious about when I talk to them about the project is there ever a turning point where he finds out about the project? And that is, of course, transformative to it, and that I don't know. So that would be a big question about its future, is like. But as for other people's practices, I mean, for example, my father died after finishing about 80% of a book about his work as a whistleblower during Vietnam, and so it's unfinished. And I think that like wanting work, even on behalf of the work, rather than the person, rather than this guy. Forget the guy. What about his art? His art deserved to live, you know? My father, a person, important to me, yes, but like, what about the end of the book? What about, like, who's defending the work, you know? So there may be some future of like, yeah, the continuation of other things cut off, but I'm not really sure yet.
That would be a very intense process for you, rewriting the end of your dad's book. Have you attempted it?
No, but I wasn't even imagining it until I was just thinking about it, but I certainly could. It's very well written. It would be hard to write the end of it, but it's not a bad idea. Yeah, because the publisher made the decision to publish it. It stops in the middle of the sentence, like we do a lot of the time. Yeah, it says something about getting a bazooka smacking close, like in the face, like, and then the book just cuts off and it's over. And there's this Fever Ray song. We were kind of talking about music when we first got started on this. There's a Fever Ray song that came out a year or two ago. That's Candy. It's a really good song. And the line, "What if I die with a song inside?" And then something about being alone forever. And that is quite a harsh thing to contemplate.
And I guess that's connecting you. Yeah, I mean they're both living on, you know, in your father's work, and I guess are speculatively in his practice, and it's sort of connecting you with them, which is really, really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but then it also seems so far removed from him at this point too. Like, you know, and by analogy, the figures in the sports section, it's at once distillation of affect, accentuation of what's already there, and then there's like this autonomy that's going on, this like independent life they're actually permitted to be even more complex than they were at the moment. I feel there's a speculative element of it too, where it's like they're brought into a realm of expression that is even more nuanced than they were sanctioned within the realm of that theater of sports. And I think what I'm doing is better in some ways than the work that he was doing when he was in his early 20s. So it's at a distant remove, but there's the energy is still there, but it's pretty weird. I mean, I don't feel connected to him really.
I think something that's been lost of me as well, Gianna, with your work, and just touching on what Abe was saying there about the parts of the figures that you choose to sort of accentuate and focus on. This work in particular here, I've had a couple of questions. This one on the end, on the right bit, that perhaps it's the nipples and the penis have been like particularly enhanced.
Yeah.
Was that a conscious choice?
Well, I mostly paint women, and all of the women that I paint are extra voluptuous. I always add more curves, and obviously, if anyone knows my work, they know that I paint and sculpt a lot of breasts, and for very different reasons than I accentuated his nipple. But I think that there's something about adding a kind of curvy element, even in the pieces over there where they're kind of ambiguous. You don't know even sometimes if they're men or women. You don't see their faces. There's a kind of simplification of form, but then like highlighting certain body parts. And the sports section, to me, even though it's not that evident in this grouping that we're showing, is so erotic and it's so sexualized in ways. And I see that because I don't watch football. I don't like engage in sports. I don't really know any names of athletes. And so to me, I just see the space as this very kind of fascinating like theater where there's all of this emotion and crying and hugging and groping and a lot of like, a lot of the time there are these men very publicly jumping into each other's arms and wrapping their legs around each other and smiling and kissing or crying and kissing. And it has an element of eroticism to me that is beautiful and fascinating. And I think these pieces are made with such little analysis. I'm just really operating on the pleasure and play of making them. And I think this piece in particular was cute to me, actually, because it seemed like they were like kindergartners, like antagonizing each other and then kind of fighting it out, and then they would hug and make up. And there's this kind of gaze between the guy with the glowing nipple and the one who's not part of the fight in the middle. A kind of strange tension between them that I liked. And there's an element of romance in sports that's somehow washed out by the context of it being a sporting environment. And when I look at it, I'm just like, wow, this is wild. This is really fun, and this is really playful, and there's so much freedom to interact in a very kind of primal way. And so I guess that was just an instinct to highlight the nipple as something that's glowing, also because they're a bit abstracted, and so it's a kind of identifying marker of the body. And some of the pieces are clothed and some of them are not clothed. Some I strip them down sometimes and make them naked, or other times they still do have the clothing on them, and sometimes it's ambiguous. But I enjoy the kind of play of finding the lines in these pieces and deciding, at what point do we see this and experience this piece truly out of context? Is it when we get closer to the piece that we see, oh, this is not a dance, this is actually sports? Or is it, at what point when I erase the background and the grass, do we feel that these are just people hugging and people embracing, or this is suddenly just subconsciously permitted because we know that it's football? And this piece, the series is right now like a body of works on newspaper that's been growing since 2014, when I was doing something similar to Abe and getting home and just doodling on the newspaper and thinking, I'm going to do this before I go to the studio, and I'm just going to play for a few hours. I was having my coffee, I was reading the paper, and I would draw over it because it was just fun to do and to make the pictures more interesting to myself. And it was never something I thought to show anyone. But I've continued to do it for 11 years now, and now that I'm quite invested in it and engaged in the project, I'm thinking about how to expand them into my painting practice. And so this was the first, I've done a few more, but this is the first kind of directly related painting to this project, and I'm still working out the kinks and finding out how I want to represent it. But I would like it to have the line of sport in it, some kind of visible thread of sport in it that is not immediately evident. So kind of just switch just like pull the players forward and the background back. And I'm not sure if that means clothing them, or if that means stripping them, or if that means adding the shoes, like in the sculpture that we see the cleats. But it's been a project that I'm not rushing, and it's really fun to kind of sit with it and let it incubate and come out very authentically and naturally. And I think it's a project that will continue for a very long time because it's a strange obsession that I have, you know.
That's I think part of the reason that we're doing this is like Gianna and I getting along artistically, having some sort of kinship, like this as my trust in your practice as having conviction and as opposed to the subject of this series, like I just have this feeling that you're not going to give up, you know? And that someone sent me the other day, a young artist sent me 2 drawings that he had made, and I wanted feedback on it. And I was thinking of what to say, and they were nice drawings. They were like, he was a talented draftsman, they were interesting. And I said, you know, I will write you a long email about the aesthetics and methods and history that I see in your pieces. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that the emergent spirit of like decades of lived practice is what it's really about. And I can't do that for you, you know? Yeah, these are 2 great drawings. Make thousands of them for the rest of your life. You know? And it doesn't even matter what they look like. I'm not like, oh, they need to be more beautiful. And it's not about quantity either. Like, I don't make like as large a number of works as you do. Everybody makes different numbers, but the depth of the reality of the work, and not being about an individual work, but the emergent spirit of the practice is what matters to me. And I think, for example, one way that could come out is you have these great pieces that show the concept, as I was saying earlier, they show the conceptual means by virtue of having the original source material visible. Then you have these others that don't. You know, that's a growth and change within the practice. And I admire that the means are available. I certainly don't think conceptual means have to be available on the surface, but I just wanted to put some words of appreciation to that, like, depth of commitment and practice, and I think that's kind of why we relate in this way. It's like
I think so too.
the sense of reality that's in it.
And also the time. I mean, what we have on view here is like essentially a preview of these large bodies of work that we've been developing for many, many years, and very intentionally and patiently, and so it's like quite nice to just have a knowledge that these bodies of work are here with us, but they extend so far beyond the work that's in this exhibition, and that feels very, very shared, a kind of obsession that is undying and that just keeps growing and evolving and mutating in many ways.
Yeah, you both have this dedication. I think what's interesting, particularly in the evolvement of your work, is this. I feel like you are placing quite a romantic lens on it. I think it'd be really interesting if you were able to speak with the men who were in these photographs. But it started with these newspapers you see here with these sort of groups of figures that aren't necessarily immediately intimate, and then we move on to this where you see there's like accentuated parts of the bodies, and then I'm thinking about your paintings, the sort of 3 that you've they're in the catalogue, but they're not on display here. They are like they are the most erotic ones in the whole body of work. So it's interesting that in that evolution you're sort of really, really honing in on that point, but probably because it's the most interesting. But again, there's this huge departure from origin, and I think that's also something that you spoke to me about, how R's practice was getting very ugly, and he was stapling dead mice, I think you were saying, to his canvases, and how you're sort of both taking things that might be, a little bit unintentional, a little bit ugly, and then making them much more beautiful and romantic, and actually true to each of you.
Yeah, and the will, and like it being okay to do that, out of unjustified inclination and joy. I think that my friend who's
I could be wrong. I think that he stopped making art in the public sense. He started making smaller and smaller work that was more and more deliberately made ugly, with like dead animals glued to it. At one point, like he glued this dead mouse to a painting, and then he chipped away at it until it was gone over the course of like a month. And our other housemate, who was more able to embrace his life as an artist, I was speaking with him about this project that our third housemate, this guy, was doing, and I was like, he's doing, and I think I was being overly charitable, and I said, he's doing a kind of Baroque conceptualism, and the other guy was like, illegible conceptualism. But yeah, I think doing it because, and I think that uglification process had something to do with guilt and the feeling of the need for justification. Something that I address in the film is that one of his last pieces that I remember seeing is him crawling around on the ground, half naked, from the waist down, saying, "Do my reveries just cause harm?" The phrase, "Do my reveries just cause harm?" You know?
Yeah.
And I feel like we're not so inclined toward that, you know?
No, I don't think so. That's something we've all spoken about a lot during this exhibition, is unrealized projects, and I think it's beautiful to see for both of you these bodies of work you've been working on for so long, to see them sort of previewed here, and then hopefully have that sort of next impression wherever that may be. And I was just wondering what other sort of unrealized projects each of you have sort of brewing, and what you feel about those. I just think it's an interesting thing we all have within us, these things that we want to do and we haven't quite been able to do yet.
Oh
I
my God,
think it's beautiful
so
that it's
many.
expressed. Yeah.
Do you mean stuff that's on its way, or that is like not going to be able to, or that is like blocked in some way? Like
Either. For me, they're like things that I've maybe thought about and like have never quite done, or I've started the first like couple of steps of it. You know, for you both, it's things have been sort of not ticking along in the background doesn't feel like it's doing justice. More like it's so intimate that it's so close to you that it's something you only share with yourself in those sort of moments in between your life. And yeah, I was just wondering what other ones you both had cooking.
Yeah, so much stuff. I don't know. Do you want to? Yeah. What have you got? It's a good topic. It's a great topic.
I have so many. Well, the one is the project of women building houses, which is the project I was working on, and then was procrastinating by painting bees, and then kind of got fully derailed and started just painting men playing instead of women building houses. And that project, I don't know, I have no idea where it ends, but it's quite big and heavy. I mean, physically the pieces are very heavy. They're covered in quartz crystal, and they are with lots of different pigments and oil paint, and they're very unlike these, they're very legible. They're quite tightly rendered, and it's hard to paint these pieces because they are so weighty and so personal, and in the process of painting them forces me to kind of confront certain things about my own history and my family's history that's just revealing, I guess, and very vulnerable. And so that's a project that is kind of happening at the same time as this body of work, and with similar interest in emotion and similar interest in expression and in, I suppose, to some extent, context, or how we shape our ideas about women and men and our relationships. And then another project is a project that is somewhat connected to the Women Building Houses project, that's just like right before I fall asleep at night, my brain will either start like spitting out all of these random words and voices, or I will see like an image, and it depends on what I've been feeding my brain. So if I'm like listening to very specific podcasts and seeing exhibitions that I'm intentional about or that I stumble upon and are relevant, and the music that I like, everything kind of gels, and right before I fall asleep, I'll just have a kind of like crystallized image of all of the content that somehow solves whatever emotional state I'm in, and it's just like a perfect kind of representation of what's on my mind. And so I'll wake up and I'll do a little kind of hieroglyph of that image, and then I will repeat it obsessively for months and sometimes years until it becomes something. And so I have this kind of catalog of images that are like pre-dream images that I would like to do a series of, and that have made their way into my work, and was the kind of the first Women Building Houses piece was one of those images. And so that I'm not sure if it's its own series or if it's just part of all of the work that I do all of the time. But I would like to kind of realize that whole project at some point. And I don't actually know if they're tiny pieces, or if they're sculptures, or if they're paintings. But it's a project that I think will probably be going on as long as I'm pre-dreaming. So
it's amazing that you can remember that when you wake up. Because one of my first questions
not always.
the moment you're writing that down.
I wake myself up.
Okay.
Yeah, because I'm really aware of the time when I'm falling asleep. It's this weird thing. Like my conscious mind can say like, oh, this is happening. You're starting to hear voices. You're starting to see images. Your body is full. Like I can say that to myself as I'm falling asleep.
So are you falling asleep then?
I'm observing myself fall asleep. Yeah, it's really strange. And then, and if I don't fall asleep right then, I have like pulled myself out of it and written down phrases I've heard or images that I've seen. Or other times I will just actually pull myself out of bed and make the thing right then, like sculpt the thing. And on my floor, like with clay. It's messy and wild, but some of my best work has been like, oh, I have to make this and I'm gonna do it now. And I think that's why I like the newspapers, and even the sculpture was like, oh, I was talking to someone and I was like, oh, it would be nice if you enter a room and then you just saw all of the players after they lost the game, and they all 7 or however many were on the ground, and what an entry. And then I was like, I should do that, and then immediately I just did it. And so there's such an immediacy with the work that I think is like important to me. And maybe one of the reasons I'm struggling with Women Building Houses is because it's like huge paintings and they're grueling, and I can't finish one in a day, or I might be able to, but I haven't managed to yet. And so it like every time I restart, it kind of reboots the whole system, and I have to kind of overpaint everything to get the freshness and the vitality. Like we were talking about Miriam Khan, all of her work is produced in like one kind of flash or one day, one session. And there is something to that where if you're working so fast that your analytical mind can't butt in and say, well, why are you doing that? Why are you making the nipple bright? You know, like I'm saying like, no, you're not allowed to do that. And after, it becomes very relevant. And then after, I'm like, oh, I kind of reverse engineer the whole process, and it makes a lot more sense to me to do it that way than to plan everything in advance. Because I think I trust my subconscious in terms of my art practice more than like my kind of math mind.
Yeah, and this beautiful sort of automatism.
Yeah, it's very raw. Exactly, it's very, very raw, and I think that's where it's best, is when I'm also observing myself and making something. I'm also making from that pre-dream state where I'm like, oh, this is a flow state. Like, just go for it and don't think about it. Or I am more, I'm watching myself work rather than figuring out what I'm doing.
Because you mentioned to me the other day that you blotted out time recently to try to think. Is that right? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do that every couple of years. That sounds strange, but I think it's actually true. Like, I think on purpose about once every 3 or 4 years. I think, and now I should think, and I sit down and I write a sequence of connected thoughts that are consciously building on each other. I don't think I think a lot in that sense. And I think that that's more of like the analytic philosopher's sense of sort of progressive accumulation of each component like logically following the other. But honestly, that is like
that's when I feel like I have an idea in my mind that I haven't found yet, and I need to like force myself to think, and then usually like a month later I have the idea. But I mean, since we visited, it's a personal conversation, but we realized at some point that we hear the same sound that wakes us up when we. I mean, so this is really weird.
This is very weird.
So
I mentioned it to someone else, and they were like,
okay,
"That sounds
so
really disturbing."
can I share this?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
so my I have a lot of unrealized projects, and I think partly because my father died young, I have this I'm very motivated by a sense of running out of time, even though I don't believe that I am in the way that he did, hopefully, but just like death and the song, what if I die with a song inside kind of feeling. But so I have a lot of projects, and I wasn't thinking about this when you asked the question, but the primary project I'm working on, we're having talked about this with you before, is manufacturing all of the objects that I've had in my dreams over like a 15-year period.
Oh my God!
Not all of them. Yeah, I mean they're not the like hypnagogic falling asleep. It will be every morning when I wake up, I write down my dreams along with sort of banal record of what I did the previous day. And this very often involves artworks or objects. But yeah, I mean, I think it was just, it's an interesting sort of anecdote, I guess, about the relationship between our projects that you said the other night that when we were talking about having trouble falling asleep, you'll be falling asleep and then you'll hear a knock. And I was like, that has been happening to me for like 20 years, like, except that it knocks 5 times for you and once for me. And I was just like really quite haunted by that.
Yeah,
But the subject matter of dreaming and that part of the mind it's seemingly what we're both working on. And I don't know, we're like very connected in these ways. But something I find very interesting, because a lot of my work is about the form, encountering the form, and then what changes when you find out something about the form that you didn't know. Dream objects or dream characters very often in general are other than themselves in ways that concepts, this thing that we call the concept of art, whatever, it's weird language, but the thing that makes something not itself or that broadens it into something beyond itself, I think very often in dreams, the objects are always conceptual in that sense, because we were talking about Eliot the other night, Jasper. There's a famous line of Eliot encountering the eyes of a familiar compound ghost. People and objects in dreams are the familiar compound ghost. It's like, it's my mother, but it's not my mother, or it's a bottle, but it's actually like a strong sign of like grief in some way. And so like the question then becomes, I think, not how do I accomplish the mechanical manufacture of a host of formal descriptions of objects, which then renders a show that is like impenetrably boring for anybody to look at, but how do I like render them in a way that somehow conveys their otherness from themselves. Like, I had a dream years ago in one of my many dream journals that I've kept for decades about a wooden crucifix with a tripod base that was made out of popsicle sticks. So when I'm in the process right now, beginning this project of going through years of journals, extracting the objects and deciding which one motivates me to manufacture it. And so I'm at the beginning of this project, having just finished a different unrelated project, but deciding which ones have a call, or would have a presence for others, or could be manufactured in a manner that somehow calls to or suggests their otherness from themselves, which may partly just be that they're dream objects, like I'm not like a huge John Berryman fan, poet in general, I mean, a problem with him, but the title Dream Songs and their derivation from dreams. So the working title of that project is Dream Songs. It's like objects that are, and maybe this otherness from themselves is merely the fact of having come from dreams, like this crucifix popsicle stick thing, like just knowing that it's from someone's dream may be enough to kind of like mark it as being other than itself, in a way that we are ourselves, but maybe you can miss my grandmother for me. The object is itself, but is also not itself. But yeah, it's just interesting to find, like, when you make a friend, you're like, I mean, especially considering that it was like this actual specific sound.
Yeah, that was very strange.
But yeah, I don't know what you all envisioned time-wise, and I did want to say at some point, like, how I live in a place and time that I'm very fortunate to have a lot of time for my practice, but not a lot of time to talk with others, and I think that the nature of like listening to others talk about their practice, which like is physically demanding and often very boring, even though it's also interesting, and boredom is like part of everything. I just like so appreciate being here and being able to do this. Like, so thank you.